All right, everybody, here is my video as promised about my new block system that's black and white, so you can print it without a color printer, and hopefully the way I've labeled is clear and won't be confusing. So first things I want to point out is these labels here. You have one that's in a square and one that's in a rounded square. So the one that's in a square, that is the name of the block. When you are looking at the grid of where the blocks go, this tells you where the block goes in the picture. And then this number in the rounded square, rounded rectangle, that indicates the order that you sew the sections in. So my sections used to be separated with red lines. Now they're separated with dashed lines. This dashed line is where you're going to cut the block into pieces. And so this is showing you, I picked a relatively simple one for this example. This is showing you that you have this block and you sew it to this block. So this is the first one, you sew to this. Now, some are more complex and are broken up into like 1A, 1B. So if it says 1A, 1B, and 2, that means that 1A and 1B have to be sewn together before you can sew it to 2. Or if you have 1 and you have 2A, 2B, that means 2A and 2B have to be sewn together before they can be sewn to 1. Okay, so these bigger letters, that's indicating what to do with the block. And then these smaller letters are indicating what fabrics you're using and the order you're sewing it in, right? So if I look at this and it says B NRO3, that means that A, I sew first, B, I sew second, and NRO3 is the fabric that goes in that spot. I've also added a seam allowance around the outside. Now, I still don't have a seam allowance in between sections, and I have a video talking about why I don't do that, but I did add a seam allowance around the outside. There are some blocks that are so large that when you print it, it might not print all the way because it will go all the way out to the edge. But keep in mind that you always want to be using your ruler anyway when you're trimming, just to make sure that it's right. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to cut out my sections. So I have my 2 sections here. Now I can sew the pieces on each of these sections before I sew them back together. So now you can see that I've sewn the pieces onto these sections. And now what I need to do is I need to trim along the seam allowance. Now here the seam allowance is marked, but here where I've split it into 2 sections, the seam allowance is not marked, but I'm just going to measure that. Okay, now I've trimmed my seam allowance. And you see I like to baste along the seam allowance. That is definitely not required. It's just something that I like to do, and I'll put out when I pull the papers out. So now I need to sew these 2 pieces together. So in order to make sure that I've lined them up properly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at right here where the line meets the edge of the paper. And I'm going to put a pin right through there. Then same thing on this side, right where that line meets the edge of the paper, I'm going to put a pin through it. And now I know that it's lined up. So I'm going to do that on the other side, and then I'm going to sew it together. So I'm going to put the needle right where the pin is. Then I can pull the pin out. And then I'm going to make sure that I can see those edges are lined up. I'm going to sew right next to the edge of the paper. Not on the paper, just enough that the fabric will be able to fold over. As I'm working towards the end, you can see that I have this other pin, and I'm holding it in place. And then when it gets to the end, I pull it out. And there I have it. There's the back of my block. And here's the front of my block.